Brown versus Board of Education said that segregation laws were unequal or were unconstitutional, but there was no way to enforce that except by the court. All right, so in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1956, actually, yeah, 1955 is actually when it happened. They that was the year I was born, by the way. So at any rate, the point, me and Disneyland, both in 1955, but there was a NAACP chapter in Montgomery, and there was a woman who was the secretary of the local NAACP chapter named Rosa Parks, who you guys, if you go to the campus, you can see there's kind of a monument to Rosa Parks right at the entrance there, coming from the armory. But at any rate, the she was also a seamstress at a local department store, and when she left work one afternoon, she got on the bus and sat down. The law in Montgomery said that the black people had to sit behind white people. So a black person, if the bus was empty, the black person could sit wherever they wanted. But if white people got on, they had to move to the back of the bus so that the white people could sit in front of them. You guys follow me here? And so what happened on this one day was that Rosa Parks sat near the front of the bus, and enough white people got on that she was not asked, but ordered to move to the back of the bus, and she refused. And so she was arrested and convicted for breaking this segregation ordinance. All right, you guys are with me? Questions? And again, there's some question about whether or not that was a test case, but it becomes a test case because what happens is that law is actually appealed, that conviction is actually appealed until the federal courts overturn the conviction and also overturn the law, right? You guys are with me? So that actually ends up working, but there's something different that happens in Montgomery. And what it is that the people of Montgomery, the black people in Montgomery, decide not to just try this case in the law, but to also respond to the law with mass resistance, I guess you could say, right? Or non-cooperation. And so they establish a boycott. The boycott of the bus system essentially says black people are not going to ride the bus until the law is changed, which is, it's actually, there's two ways to think about this. In one hand, it probably has some financial impact on the bus system because black riders were probably the majority of the bus system riders. But it also is a challenge to the culture of the South, because the suggestion that black people and white people are equal is offensive to most whites in the South at this time, right? And so when you challenge that inequality, you're challenging the deeply held ontological outlook of the white society, and they're going to respond with violence, which is what they do, right? So when this boycott goes into place, they ask for the support of a local preacher at one of the more successful and prosperous black churches in Montgomery, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And his name is Martin Luther King Jr., and he reluctantly decides to take a leadership role in this boycott. But there's a difference between, or I should say it this way, King brought to the scene a very different strategy than had been used by black people up to this point. And where he gets this strategy really begins in the 1840s in the United States with a man named Henry David Thoreau. You probably have heard of Thoreau. You may or may not know anything that he wrote, but one thing that he wrote was a pamphlet called Civil Disobedience. And the pamphlet, Civil Disobedience, was a reflection on an experience that he had had, which was that he refused to pay his poll tax on the grounds that paying a tax to a government that was immoral was immoral. And he felt that the government of Massachusetts was immoral because it supported slavery in the United States and it supported the Mexican-American War. So he refused to pay his poll tax and was put in jail. And then the next morning, his mom came and bailed him out. Okay, and so his sacrifice wasn't exactly great, but he does write this pamphlet, which is going to have a great impact later, called Civil Disobedience. And the basic idea behind civil disobedience is that it is immoral to follow an immoral law. But if you're going to break the law and not follow, if you're going to challenge the law, you have to do it openly. You can't just say, well, I don't agree with the government, so I'm not going to pay my tax and I hope they don't catch me, right? You have to say, I'm not going to pay this tax, right? And this strategy is actually adopted by a man in India named Mohandas Gandhi. You probably have heard of Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma is actually a kind of a honorific. It means, you know, great soul. But his name was Mohandas Gandhi, and he adopted Thoreau's strategy of nonviolent non-cooperation. And basically what he said was that British rule over India was immoral, and so therefore the people of India should not cooperate with the British government. And he ended up spending many years of his life in jail because of it, right? But the main kind of point behind his strategy was to be nonviolent, which is what Thoreau had actually called for, right? And the reason why that's important is because if you are challenged, if somebody is violent towards you, it's a natural reaction to respond with violence. And that's what happens in all rebellions, right? If the British were violent against the American colonists, the colonists responded with violence, right? You see what I'm saying? And they felt justified in doing it. But Gandhi's strategy, Thoreau's strategy was that if you're violent toward me and I don't respond with violence, then what that does is it demonstrates the immorality of your law. If you have to use violence against me to enforce your law, then that means your law is immoral. And if I respond with nonviolence and take the blows, then that will demonstrate the immorality of your law. You follow me here? So the idea here then is that rather than responding with violence, I'm going to refuse to respond with violence, and I'm going to allow you to be violent against me. And the result of that is that you and everybody else will understand the immorality of your law. Okay, well, that is a great idea, but it only works if it's done in the open, right? So if we're in secret and somebody isn't, we're in the back room in the jail and they say, you're either going to do what I tell you or I'm going to kill you, and you say, well, okay, kill me. Well, you're dead, but nobody saw it, so who's going to know? You see what I'm saying? But if it's done in the public square, if everybody can see it and it ends up on the news, then that's a different story, isn't it? Because people say, you just shot that guy for doing nothing, right? I mean, we see that all the time, don't we? Right? So I mean, it's kind of like the meme that they have now. It's like, walking while black and sleeping while black and doing these different things, right? Because there's people that are violent against them, even though they're really not provoking it, right? But in this case, they were provoking it. So the strategy that Martin Luther came up with was, well, instead of instead of just sitting around here waiting for them to be violent, we're going to provoke them into violence. We're going to go out in the streets and we're going to march and we're going to say, this is wrong. And we're going to invite the press. We want the whole press to come down here and watch what happens. And they do, right? So the press comes to Montgomery to watch what's happening. And when the Black people go out and march, you see people using fire hoses, the police using fire hoses against the people to break up the march. And you see snarling dogs against little kids, right? And people all over the country are watching this and say, what's going on down there? What's happening down there, right? And remember how we talked about ontology and how does what's ontological change? What's ontological changes when you're forced to see it, when you're forced to, when there's a crisis in what you believe, right? And at this point, what we see happening is people in America start to see the issue of Jim Crow as really violent, as really immoral. You follow what I'm saying here? And the result of that then is going to be that eventually that will be reflected in the people's representatives in government, right? So even though we can see that the strategy of test cases was successful in changing individual laws, it was unsuccessful in challenging Jim Crow as an institution. And even though the strategy employed by Martin Luther King was ineffective in changing the law, it did challenge Jim Crow in such a way that Jim Crow comes to be seen as evil by the people. And eventually that leads to leadership in the national government that will institute changes that will bring about the end that the civil rights movement started with. If you remember going back here, all the way back to the 1870s, what do we want? We want civic equality and political rights. Okay, and now in 1964 and 1965, we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically nullifies all Jim Crow laws everywhere, right? And we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which removes barriers to voting. Okay, one of the ways that Black people in the South had been or actually not just in the South, but in other places, had been disenfranchised was by erecting barriers to voting, like poll taxes and literacy tests and things like that. And the result was that the white population was able to keep strong control over the political system. But when the Voting Rights Act overturned all of those restrictions and Black people could register and vote, that made huge changes in politics around the country. Okay. Now, so we'll just leave it there for a second and let's stop and think now, right? That, well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 mandates and enforces legal equality, civic equality for Black people, for everybody really. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 provides, removes barriers to the franchise for everybody. You guys follow what I'm saying here? So we could say, well, this is a great victory, and it is, okay, because this is going to really be the catalyst for the changes that come after it, right? But and so if you were to actually look at, if you were to buy a book about the civil rights movement, generally speaking, right, or you watch a video on TV, there was a great PBS documentary, I can't remember the name of it now, Eyes on the Prize, I think was the name of it. But at any rate, the point of it is that they started in 1954 and they end in 1965, right? So we would say, oh, the civil rights movement was 1954 to 1965, right? But in fact, the civil rights movement started at the very beginning of Jim Crow, and it continues today. Okay. And even though 1964 and 1965 were a great turning point, it didn't end race division in the United States. As you all know, I mean, I don't have to tell you this, right? Okay. And the reason why is because there's going to be an enormous reaction to it, right? So if you think, okay, well, the Civil Rights Act ended civic inequality and the Voting Rights Act made it possible for everybody to vote. So we're all happy now, no more racism, right? And even going further, we can say, well, look, we've got a black president, so we're obviously not racist, right? You follow what I'm saying here, right? But the reality is, after the Civil Rights Act and after the Voting Rights Act, race relations got worse. They didn't get better, not for a long time. And really, what ended up happening was there was a struggle for over race until into the 1970s, and then we all kind of just forgot about it. It's like, okay, well, I guess we're over racism now. You know what I'm saying? And so then we can see today there are some struggles continuing. For example, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 took away the barriers to voting. One of the ways that they did that was that they wouldn't allow different states to enact voting laws without approval by the United States government, right? Well, the problem, of course, with that is that it violates the 14th Amendment, okay? And that was overturned in, like, I think 2012 or something like that, whatever. But the first thing that happened after that was then that these different states start passing laws restricting voting rights, okay? So you see states like Texas and Georgia and North Carolina, and even northern states. I remember, I think Michigan, Ohio, are passing laws that the effect of the law is to restrict access to the ballot box for minorities. You follow what I'm saying? So this struggle, we may have had a great victory in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but the struggle goes on. Do you follow what I'm saying? And the same thing with civil rights. Okay, so I mean, one of the most basic civil rights is the right to live. Do you follow what I'm saying here? One of the most basic civil rights is the right to live, and yet we have been able to see for decades that policemen can kill black people with no consequence, right? That's the whole issue behind Black Lives Matter, right? It's not that Black Lives matter more than other lives. It means that they matter at all, because up until today, the statistics say that Black lives don't matter. You follow what I'm saying? Okay, so when we look at this sea change that happened in American public opinion between 1954 and 1965, can you describe that to me? You better be able to, because I just told you less than half an hour ago.
You said the change in, sorry, what was that?
The change in American public opinion between 1954 and 1965. People looked at Jim Crow in 1954. What did they see?
Well, I mean, white people saw Jim Crow and they thought it was fine, obviously, but then after the changes, everything still was the same, if not worse, in terms of public opinion. Like you said, race relations got worse.
Okay, but I'm glad I brought this up because I want to make sure that we're straight on this, okay? In 1954, everybody knew that Jim Crow was there. Most people didn't think about it, okay? So like if you lived in the South, you were invested in enforcing Jim Crow, or if you lived in a place where Jim Crow was part of the culture, then you were invested in enforcing it. If you were elsewhere, if you were in Los Angeles or in Denver or someplace like that, you didn't care. I mean, you knew it was there and you probably knew it was wrong, but you didn't really think about it. You know, it was just like, that's their problem, not mine. I don't deal with that, right? And so you didn't have any kind of personal investment in it, even ideologically, right? But when you start watching on TV, you know, churches being blown up and little kids being killed, right? And little kids being attacked on TV with snarling dogs, right? By policemen, or people being beat up on the Pettus Bridge for just trying to register to vote, then you're going to start to say, well, you know, this is wrong. This is not what we stand for. Do you see what I'm saying? And so what we see happening is this sea change in attitude between 1954 and 1965, where before 1964, most people didn't even think about Jim Crow. And by 1965, most people thought it was evil, right? You see what I'm saying here? Now, not everybody, obviously a lot of people, some people are still in favor of Jim Crow, okay? And they're more vocal now than they have been for some time. But at any rate, can you think of anything that might be happening right now that demonstrates that same kind of a sea change in public attitude?
I guess you could maybe use the George Floyd incident as an example, right? We didn't really, I mean, there wasn't as much protest going on before that incident, and that's when that moment kind of changed the point of view of Americans and made more protest apparent.
Okay, let's think of, you're onto something there. Let's go back a few years. And I don't know how much of this you guys remember, but after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, there were enormous, well, there were protests in Ferguson, and they turned violent. They turned into riots, right? Okay, and coming out of that, most people came to think of the Black Lives Matter movement as being a bunch of thugs, a bunch of terrorists, right? Does that sound right? You guys are with me on that?
Yeah, I remember you talking about Michael Brown and Eric Garner. A few years back, I remember.
And whenever Black Lives, they blamed all the riots on Black Lives Matter, right? Which you can argue about that, and I'm not going to get into the details of it right now. But the main thing is to see the public opinion is, oh, those guys are a bunch of troublemakers, right? They want things that they can't have, okay? That sort of thing. And if you looked at that extra credit that I gave you, the video about the Black Lives Matter group and the Trump group, and how, you know, the Trump group thought the Black Lives Matter group were a bunch of terrorists, essentially, right? You guys follow me here? What happened was that they were consistent, and they were tenacious about their demand. What's the basic demand of the Black Lives Matter movement? What are they mostly against? Or I say, what are they for?
Racial justice,
all ranges,
racial equality.
Okay, but now the specific incident that brought Black Lives Matter into existence was Trayvon Martin. So what's the specific issue involved there?
Police brutality.
Police brutality, right? One of the things that you'll notice on the movie that you guys are going to be watching this weekend is that they're actually the riots in Detroit were started by and were motivated by the idea of police brutality. This happens in 1967, right? So now in 2018, we're still rioting, we're still protesting police brutality. Did we make any changes to police brutality or police accountability because of these riots? No, right? But think about now, after George Floyd, we saw people all over the country, in fact, all over the world, they're out there identifying with Black Lives Matter. You follow what I'm saying here? So we've seen this sea change in our own lifetimes, right? We've seen how public opinion can be brought to bear in favor of justice right, in favor of what Meacham calls our better angels. We can see that this is happening, right? But the struggle isn't over. It goes on. You follow what I'm saying? We'll make some progress, and then we'll actually change the subject, and we'll have to go back to it again, right? This is the way history works, all right? Um, but at any rate, so when you say the reason why I did this lecture really wasn't so that I could harangue you guys about Black Lives Matter, but it was because I wanted to demonstrate the difference between, or the difference in the strategies of the NAACP and what becomes known as the Civil Rights Movement or Southern Christian Leadership Conference. One of them is based on litigation, which can change the law but not change people's minds. And one of them is based on mass protest, which can't change the law but does change people's minds, which eventually does change the law.